Alright, what's up guys? Thank you for tuning in to Fancy Free Philosophy. Learning how society works best by discussing news, history, philosophy, and economics. So you and I have good info to defend liberty. So to start, many Democrats say the economy under Trump is only good for rich people. Today we'll examine some common attacks on the Trump economy and help you know how to respond. We'll look at recent data and some key policies, so you have evidence to use in your political discussions. So the jobs report from about 2 months ago showed average wage growth has increased at a pace above 3% for 16 straight months. That's a pace seen for 3 months total in Obama's entire 8 years. That's a pretty stark contrast. And if you think about it, Obama trying to claim credit for the Trump economy is an implicit endorsement of how good the Trump economy is, because, otherwise he wouldn't be trying to claim credit if it was a crappy economy. So he's sort of implicitly implying, well, that this economy is doing very well. And I don't really think you can put much of that credit to Obama. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so since wage growth is calculated relative to a 1-year period, wages grew by over 4% in those 16 months. Because 3% for 1 month means 0.25% in that month, because that's how they do it relative to 1-year periods, because 3 divided by 12 months is 0.25, and 16 months times 0.25 equals that 4%. But that's boring stuff. Math is for squares. So what's important is the fastest wage growth is going to the most poor Americans. The bottom 10% segment of income earners had an average of 7% wage growth over the year of 2019. So that means the poorest 10% of workers had wage growth 2 1/3 times the average, with the average being 3%, as we saw a minute ago. Also, people with no high school diploma enjoyed 9% wage growth in 2019, which is 3 times the average. So the highest wage growth is going to the most disadvantaged people, which is exactly what you would hope to see. Also, I remember seeing that either the top 1% or 10% of income earners, it's one of those, but I forget exactly which one, they had like 1.4% income growth over that period. That's a number I remember, but I know it was somewhere close to 1.5%, which is obviously way lower than what lower income people have gotten. There are other metrics you can look at, but if you're talking about who's benefiting from the current economy, I can't think of a more important metric than the money people are actually making. Their actual income and how it's shifting. So by this metric, it's actually the poorest people that are benefiting the most and the richest people that are benefiting the least under Trump's economy. Exactly the opposite of what these Democrats have tried to claim. So next, the Democrats criticized Trump and Republicans for passing a tax cut bill where the corporate tax cuts were permanent, but the individual income tax cuts expire after 10 years. Now, it would be really nice if the individual income tax cuts were permanent as well, but because of congressional rules and regulations, the corporate tax cuts only required a majority of 51 senators to make those permanent, and the individual tax cuts required 60 out of 100 senators to make those permanent. In December 2017, the Republicans held 51 Senate seats, so they needed 9 Democrat senators to vote for the tax cuts in order to make the individual tax rate cuts permanent. And, it took me a while, but I very carefully tallied up all the Democrat senators who voted for the tax cuts, and I came up with a grand total of 0. You guessed it, 0. So the Democrats who smeared the Republicans for only caring about the rich and for not making the individual tax cuts permanent, themselves voted against making the individual cuts permanent. That's so outrageous. If we use a hypothetical analogy, it's like blaming my hypothetical roommate Cornelius for our electricity getting shut off when I'm the one that didn't pay my half, while also accusing Cornelius of hating poor people and being a bootlicker to billionaires. I don't really have a roommate named Cornelius, but it's the same thing. Oh, you didn't make those tax cuts permanent. Yeah, well, you didn't vote for it, and it's like, oh, our electricity got shut off. Yeah, you didn't pay your half of the bill. It's basically the same thing. It's unreal. That's just so astronomically shameless. Like, you could give me like 7 to 10 days to invent a new adjective to describe how absurd that is, because there's not many words that can do that justice, how ridiculous that accusation is. I'd say that if your source of news tried to blame Republicans for that back then, you need to ditch them in approximately -5 years. So in 2015. So you better, try to contact some aliens to give you a time machine for all the lost time you've had getting lied to. If that's the news source you've stuck with, just in my opinion. But, you can watch whatever you want, but that's, someone that lies that blatantly is, I couldn't trust them. And either they knowingly, blatantly lied to you, or they don't have 2 IQ points to rub together. I don't know which one's worse. Whoever you support politically, I think it's important to get the news of the failures of your political opponents, but the good stuff is just as crucial, or even more so, however upsetting it might be. Because if you don't know about their successful policies and strategies, it's very hard to be more successful than them, because you're missing half the picture. Also, on tax policy, the Democrats criticize the corporate tax cuts specifically, so let's take a look at this. When our corporate tax rate was 35%, we had the highest corporate tax rate out of every OECD country, making America much less competitive globally, and it incentivized companies to place their headquarters overseas instead of in the US. So the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I'm almost certain that's what it's called. If not, it's something extremely similar. But the OECD is comprised of about 35 of the most economically advanced countries, like England, Germany, Australia, and so on. So we had the highest corporate tax rates out of all those countries before they were cut. And then Trump cut the corporate tax rate from 35% down to 21%. That's what happened with the tax cut bill. And that put us smack in the middle of the OECD countries, instead of having the highest taxes. So many of the same Democrats who criticize and oppose the corporate tax cuts are the very same politicians who say we need to be more like the Nordic countries of Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland, etc. So let's take a look. Since they say we need to be more like these Nordic countries, Sweden's corporate tax rate is 22%. Denmark's corporate tax rate is also 22%, and Switzerland's corporate tax rate averages at 17.77%. So if they actually want us to be more like those countries, then I guess Trump and the Republicans did the right thing then. So what are they mad about? That makes no sense. Really, the only thing that can make sense of that is their extreme partisanship and double standards. But anyway, I said Trump cut the corporate tax rate down to 21%, even though Congress writes the bills, because he had more to do with that than anything else in the tax cut bill. He pushed for 15% very consistently for months, because obviously if you're haggling, you ask for a higher or lower amount, depending on which side of the negotiation you're on, to try to get the best deal you can. If he pushed for 20%, we might have ended up at 25%, but he consistently stuck to 15%, so like I said, the corporate tax cuts were Trump's doing more than anything else in the bill, and he made us more like the Nordic countries, which is supposedly what a lot of the Democrats, especially the leading Democrats, say they want. First, if the Democrats wanted the individual tax cuts permanent, then like I said, they should have voted for the bill. But second, this also makes no sense because after you adjust to US dollars, people making roughly 50 to 60 grand a year or more in the Nordic countries that they love pay about 50 to 60% tax rates, sometimes close to 70% if you add up the national, local, and sales taxes, etc. So if that's the ideal, they should have promoted tax hikes for individuals and tax cuts for corporations, which is the exact opposite of what they publicly promoted. You may notice a trend here that the Democrats say the exact opposite of what's true. Also, the corporate tax cuts were not for big business. They were for all corporations. And any small fry entrepreneurs can and do incorporate into LLCs relatively easily. I know a couple small business owners with pretty small businesses that have LLCs, which are limited liability corporations. Most little convenience stores and gas stations incorporate into LLCs as well. So some guy with a little convenience store, it's a corporation most of the time. So big corporations did not pay as much of the full 35% rate as often as smaller competitors did. And the same thing goes for the new lower 21% rate. Those cuts didn't affect big corporations as much because they get all kinds of tax breaks, favorable regulations, government contracts, and subsidies anyway, by lobbying many of the same politicians who are lying about these tax cuts helping big businesses. It's the small and medium corporations that often pay higher corporate taxes because they can't afford the armies of lobbyists that the big corporations can. So the corporate tax cuts help almost all businesses, but they help the small and medium-sized businesses much more. All of this does a few key things. Number one, more businesses survive and operate. For example, let's say a city would have 5,000 businesses stay open and 5,000 businesses fail without the corporate tax cuts. Then, in an alternate dimension with tax cuts, 6,000 businesses stay open and 4,000 businesses fail. So number two, there's more jobs, especially for the poorer people, since the higher skilled and educated people have a better chance of keeping their jobs if there are 1,000 less businesses to employ people, and it's the lower skilled people that are more likely to lose their jobs. But number three, since 1,000 more employers are competing to hire and keep the workers they need, this raises the demand for workers, which raises the workers' incomes. With supply and demand, the demand side of the labor market is the amount of labor services that employers want to buy. In other words, the amount of work hours that they want to hire people for. With more job opportunities around, employers must pay workers more in order to keep them from choosing a better opportunity somewhere else. Trump's deregulation also helps out the little guy, so to speak. I'll cover this in great detail in another video, but big corporations love heavy regulation. They lobby for it, and sometimes they make ads to convince people that we need a new regulation or regulatory agency to defend against some boogeyman or some greedy exploiter, which in this case is actually them. Again, the biggest corporations have the most money for lobbying and for teams of lawyers and stuff like that, so they develop the most political connections. This greater influence helps them to mold and shape laws and regulations that help them and hurt their competitors. It's called regulatory capture, an essential part of understanding politics. The FDA and the agriculture giant Monsanto have basically become partners. The FDA regulations allow Monsanto to accumulate wealth and power with patents on various genetic strains of crops, which inevitably pollinate neighboring farms, unless you build a giant dome around your farm, which is completely not affordable or feasible, really. Then after that, your crops are pollinated by their patented strains. Then Monsanto can sue the dickens out of smaller farmers, who often do not have the time and money to compete with Monsanto in court. And yes, I said dickens, you young whippersnappers. Now get off my lawn. Kids these days. Anyway, as I was saying, whether the case is settled in or out of court, very often the farmers can only afford to pay Monsanto by giving them their farm. So the FDA's regulations are crafted to allow this stuff, and Monsanto lobbies the crap out of the FDA. Like, top Monsanto executives have gone to work at top levels of the FDA, and top FDA people have become Monsanto executives. They hook each other up with lucrative careers. Also, taxpayer-funded research labs, mostly at universities, develop various drugs. Then the federal government and the FDA sells patents for those drugs to the pharmaceutical companies that legally bribe the government and FDA by lobbying them. The government makes money by selling the patents for drugs that they forced us to pay for developing. If the government did not have the authority to regulate industries like this, then it would not matter how many piles of cash that the corporations lobbied and bribed them with. They would be unable to create crony regulations, leaving corporations no reason to lobby for them. It wouldn't matter how much you paid them, if they couldn't do it. If Major League Baseball allowed steroids, you'd probably be forced to juice up to compete to be on the starting roster. Likewise, if a corporation does not lobby, their competitor will, and the government's regulations will hurt them and help their competitor. In my opinion, the government is responsible for this cronyism by allowing steroids in business, metaphorically speaking. Trump's deregulation makes the competition fair for small and medium businesses by ending the cronyism and corruption, while also boosting the economy and employment by lowering the cost of doing business. Whether measured by total numbers or by percentage, Trump cut regulations more in his first couple years than any other president in U.S. history did in their entire time in office. As we can see, Trump's economic policies have benefited the poor and working class more than any other group. During his recent State of the Union speech, when Trump mentioned that we have the lowest unemployment rate since 1969, and the lowest black, Hispanic, and Asian unemployment in U.S. history, the Democrats were almost silent. Instead, they want everyone to believe their lie that the economy is only benefiting the rich, and that they and their programs are your only hope. Trump also mentioned that 7 million Americans have done well enough to get off of food stamps during the State of the Union, and Democrats sat on their hands for that as well. Generally, they'd rather have you depend on them than be self-reliant with your own life in your own hands. I thought the point of these programs was to get people back on their feet. So, why were they not happy for these 7 million Americans? And if they are, they certainly have not shown it, even outside of that speech in their appearances on television and stuff like that. So that's just something to think about. Alright, that'll be all for this video, but thank you for tuning in, guys. There's a link in the description to my Subscribestar account if you'd like to donate and help make this a full-time, Monday through Friday show in the future. That's the eventual goal. Also, please help by clicking like, and the comments will help out too. It'll boost up my videos in the algorithms. I hope you enjoyed the video. Just give me any feedback you want to. And I do plan on making a video show in the future, but there's reasons I'm not right now. Thank you again for listening. Stay fly, long live philosophy, and I'll talk to you guys soon.